So we previously have looked at our sensory memory and our short-term and working memory. But we need to dig a little bit more into how short-term and working memory actually work. So we're going to focus on describing the strategies that you can use to help you remember information, and then also how you can better encode information to learn it and remember it. So, what are some effortful processing strategies that can help us remember information? Well, here's a giant list of them, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail in the next slide. So, let's talk about chunking. Chunking is an important strategy. Why? Well, we know that there's a lot of information coming at us at any given time. So, it's best to organize it into chunks or pieces that make it more manageable. So an example would be maybe demos that we do in class with numbers. An example would be a phone number. So if somebody yells out a phone number or an address or something like that that's kind of long, you're going to need to be able to chunk that into pieces. So most people, when they give a phone number, they give their area code, so 608, and then the next chunk, which is 845, and then the next chunk, which is 4675, which is my old school phone number. So we chunked that into meaningful or manageable groups. Okay, now the more meaning that we attach to chunking, the better. It would even be how I'm trying to organize any of our lessons or any of our learning and teaching. So chunking it out into small groups that tend to have pieces related to them. Okay, so small, manageable chunks. The next memory aid would be mnemonics. And mnemonics help us by mostly using vivid images because it's easier to remember images and organizational strategies. Mnemonics are important because they allow us to remember information. Okay, so chunking allowed us to hold more information in our short-term memory to hopefully get it into long-term memory. But mnemonics actually allow us to remember more information. So I've included a few examples here. The peg word method is explained in your book. So it would be memorizing a sentence. 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree. And you memorize that whole sentence. And you know you're going to visualize a bun, right? And you know that that's item number 1. And then you would visually associate whatever you are trying to remember with the peg word. The peg word would be bun, shoe, tree. So let's say that I had a list of groceries, or I have a list of brain parts that I need to remember in order, right? So maybe I'm trying to remember the brain stem and I want to remember it in order. So I start visually picturing a bun wrapped around the medulla. And then I picture the pons lying in a shoe, right? And so you would kind of visualize it that way. Now, I personally hate the peg word method. I'm always like, why would I memorize one list to then memorize another list so that I'm visualizing 2 separate things? But it's actually really effective for those of you that might want to put time into it. Something that works a little bit better for me is called the method of loci. So this is visualizing, like again, if I need to remember a list, we'll use the example of a grocery list. I might ask you to close your eyes and picture my house. Now, cut that in half because my house is very small, whatever you're picturing, okay? But visualize whatever house is in your mind for me. And let's say that when you walk in the door to my house, you see toilet paper hanging from the ceiling fan. You're like, wow, Dom's kind of a mess. She toilet papers her own living room. And then you walk through the living room into the kitchen and there's milk running out of the faucet. And you look down and there's honey stuck to your shoes. And as you continue walking, right? And I could like keep going. So then I could ask you, all right, open your eyes. What do I need to remember from the grocery store? And hopefully you would picture walking through my house. And the first thing you saw was toilet paper hanging from the ceiling fan. So toilet paper and then milk and then honey. So I know you guys have phones and, whatever for remembering lists, but you don't always have your phone or you can't always put a list in your phone. So the method of loci can be really effective. First letter technique is something we've been using, FM Spavta. A more common one might be like if you memorize the Great Lakes and you did that using homes as a way to memorize them, or acrostics, which we used with hypothalamus and amygdala, right? Off of hypothalamus, we wrote hunger, pituitary gland, thirst, temperature. So those are just examples of mnemonics. Now, again, those take a lot of time, but the goal is to be able to actually learn and remember the information. Okay. Now, a third thing that we can use is more of an organizational system. It has a lot in common with chunking, but it's where we divide information into categories. Okay. So if we start out with effortful processing at the top, and then I tell you, there are 3 things that we need to know about effortful processing. One would be sensory memory, and one would be short-term and working memory, and then one would be strategies. And then off of that, the strategies are chunking, mnemonics, and hierarchies, right? So you can see how that's a hierarchy. It takes one big concept and it divides it into categories so that, again, we can take anything we're learning and we can put them into those chunks. We can put them into those categories. So it's another way to essentially give meaning to what we're learning. Now, another thing that actually ties to improving our ability to encode information and get it from our short term to our long term would be distributed practice. So the first part of this is called the spacing effect. And what we know about this is we need to encode our information over time. So if you cram for a test, in psychology, that's called massed practice. If you cram for a test, you might perform okay on that test, right? Depending on how your brain works and what questions are on it and all of that. But you didn't learn that information, right? So it's gonna be hard for you to pass that test in May if you're constantly cramming for tests because you're not learning it. Now, if instead you distribute that practice over time, so over several days or even weeks, that's called distributed practice. We know that that is a more reliable way of learning. You guys, in all of psychology, one of the most well-researched and scientifically backed findings is distributed practice. So if you want to be successful on your AP exams, if you want to be successful on a college final exam, you have to space out your learning and studying over time. You can't just pack it all into one night or 2 nights. Another thing that falls under this is called the testing effect. Now, what that basically says is that repeated testing of information actually improves our learning and memory. So a test is not just assessing what you know. If I give you a test and then another test that's comprehensive and then another test that's comprehensive, or a quiz and then another quiz and then another quiz, it's actually helping you learn and remember. It's not just a grade. It's not just punitive. It's not just to be like, haha, look at all the stuff you know or don't know. It's actually good teaching practice, okay? And then our final part is levels of processing, and we're going to talk about that coming up on the next slide, but I just wanted you to see that it does fit here, okay? We know that deep processing will help us with learning and retention more than shallow processing. So our final thing to look at then is what are the levels of processing and how do those help with encoding? So shallow processing is not as effective. We know that that's processing something according to sound, which is called acoustic encoding, structure, or appearance, which is called visual encoding. So I gave you some examples here of a young kid who just using sound learns the word to. Well, you have to differentiate TWO or TOO, right? So if all you've done is processed according to sound, then you haven't actually learned to differentiate that material. What about visual encoding? So in college, in order to be successful on my exams, I'm a strong visual learner. So what I would do is I would go over my notes, attend every lecture, write a ton of information. And I could literally on exam day, close my eyes and picture exactly where it was in my notes on the test. So that's like crazy, right? But I had a very strong visual encoding sense. Now, do I remember most of what I learned? No, not at all. Okay. And that wouldn't have been an effective strategy for a final exam. So acoustic and visual encoding are shallow processing. They're not great. They're not very effective. And they're less likely to ensure learning. Also with shallow processing, this is another key term. One of the things that we do is maintenance rehearsal. Do you find yourself reading over your notes? Do you find yourself looking at a term and just repeating the definition in your head? This is shallow processing, the least effective way to learn and remember. So let's look at the most effective way, right? What is deep processing? Deep processing is using semantic encoding, another key term, okay? And semantic just means meaning. So encoding information based on meaning. Remember, encoding is how do we get information from our short term into our long term? How do we make sense of it? What we know is that the more personally meaningful something is, the greater the learning and retention. It's called the self-reference effect. So if you can take the information that you're learning and tie it to yourself or somebody that you know, if you can use stories and things like that, you are more likely to learn and remember it. So that's what you should be doing with everything that we're talking about in these videos, right? Even if you're just applying it to academic learning, if you apply it to you, you will remember it better. Now, another process or another thing that you can do in deep processing is what's called elaborative rehearsal. So you're not just going over it and over and over it in your head and saying like, here's the term, here's the definition, but instead you're elaborating on that definition. You're thinking to yourself, and what did she talk about in class with this? Or did she tell a story? Or did she have us use a memory technique? Or did we watch a video on this thing, right? So you're kind of adding to everything you know about that one term. So, what is kind of our final key point for this whole short term memory and the best way to get it into long term memory? What we know is that the amount remembered will depend largely on the amount of time you spent learning it, which was Ebbinghaus's retention curve and the spacing effect, and making the material personally meaningful or relevant.